Director Baz Luhrmann utilizes composition within this shot by positioning Tom faced away on his own side of the room and places Gatsby beside Daisy to demonstrate their unity, reveal the power dynamic, and establish Tom as the outsider in this scene. Gatsby uses storytelling to convince characters and audiences of his legitimacy, contesting the underlying macro-narrative of the 20s. This demonstrates how through the construction of narrative, an individual can control any situation. By controlling their public narratives, Othello and Gatsby are able to manipulate societal structures and establish their connection to the world. Shakespeare and Luhrmann reveal to their audiences the power of storytelling in challenging prevailing cultural values by relying on narrative and the power of storytelling in constructing a public identity. An individual may lose sight of their authentic self, emphasizing how narrative shapes an individual's perception of themselves. Shakespeare and Luhrmann focus on elements of micronarrative to show how an obsession with a singular, fixed perspective of one's personal story can have adverse effects on an individual's sense of self through their titular characters. Othello uses his reputation as a high-ranking military soldier as a gateway into the social hierarchy, relying on his public image to form his identity. But when it is no longer enough to keep him high on the social scale, he loses control of his own self. Shakespeare uses zoomorphic imagery comparing Othello to a toad and dehumanizing him as a reflection of the prevailing cultural narratives of the time, thereby challenging his contextual values through Othello by revealing how cultural macro-narrative informs an individual's micro-narrative, which is further demonstrated in this quote. The color symbolism is again a demonstration of Shakespeare's defiance of Elizabethan beliefs and his perspective on the relationship between cultural and personal narratives. It is clear that Othello has internalized the racist ideas of the 17th century and establishes his perception of himself around it. This justifies how relying on narrative and the power of storytelling shapes an individual's perception of themselves, which is reflected through Jay Gatsby, who crafts his public identity through the use of storytelling.
I'm Gatsby.
In this scene, Gatsby is confident in his identity, which is revealed through the facial expression showed by the slow-motion close-up shot. Here, however, Gatsby is uneasy, worried about Daisy's perception of him and his public identity, as shown through the diegetic silence, contradictory to the previous scene in which Gatsby is very secure with himself. The divergence between the two scenes reveals Gatsby's vulnerability when his reputation can't speak for him. Luhrmann reveals the detrimental effect storytelling can have on an individual's sense of identity by demonstrating how cultural narratives determine their micronarrative, shaping one's perception of themselves.
Gatsby looked in that moment as if he had killed a man.
Luhrmann uses this shot to allow a deeper understanding of Gatsby's loss of control over his public narrative and therefore his identity. Furthermore, the simile used in Nick's voiceover draws a comparison between Gatsby to a murderer, further emphasizing the pernicious effect a loss of control has over Gatsby's sense of identity.